Welcome to Beyond the Battlefield, the exclusive podcast of the Canadian Institute for Military and Veteran Health Research, where we provide access to insights on the intersection of science and service. Each week, we meet with leading researchers and people with lived experience to discuss issues affecting military, veterans, and families. Join us as we unpack the findings to bridge the gap between military, veteran, and family health research and real-world impact. In today's episode, we sit down with Dr. Rachael Gribble and Dr. Nathalie Reid to discuss identities, lifestyle dimensions, and community building among military and public safety personnel families. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's episode. As you listen to this podcast, feel free to leave feedback in the comments section below. Did you learn something new? Do you have something to share about the topics discussed? At the end of this podcast, we also invite you to complete a short survey by clicking on the survey link in the podcast description section. Your input helps us create content that's valuable to you. Dr. Gribble is a lecturer in war and psychiatry at King's College London, UK. As a mixed methods researcher with a background in public health, the focus of her work is on military families, women's health, and public attitudes to the military, with a primary aim of understanding how occupation influences the well-being of families. Her particular focus is on the health and well-being of partners of UK military personnel and veterans. While Dr. Reid's research program centers the experiences of educators in conversations around well-being in schools, her role as the director of the Child Trauma Research Center at the University of Regina has brought her to engage in research in 6 priority areas: child and youth mental health and well-being, prevention and intervention with children and youth, educators' education and students' mental health and well-being in schools, the pre- and post-migration traumas of refugee and immigrant children, youth, and families, climate trauma, and supporting public safety personnel families. She engages in leading-edge, strength-based, and responsive projects that seek to innovatively engage with, support, and sustain the health and well-being of children and youth, as well as those entrusted with their care. She also focuses on innovative knowledge translation and mobilization to ensure that the research serves for those whom it is intended. Hello, Dr. Gribble and Dr. Reid. Thank you both for joining us today on the Beyond the Battlefield podcast. We're very excited to have you here and appreciate you taking the time to come chat with us. As you know, we are doing an entire series dedicated to military families, and we've included guests with a wide variety of perspectives in the military family research space. As a starting question to both of you, would you be able to touch on what you feel is the current landscape of military family health research and how your work fits into the space?
From a UK perspective, we are still, I think, catching up to a lot of the work that's been done in the US, and certainly that's been done in Canada. I think some of the wonderful work that's come out of there has been amazing at kind of setting some of that scene. So for us, it's really about trying to get a good understanding about our context, what is happening here, how that might be similar or different to other contexts. Where my work sits is looking largely at health and well-being of military partners and their experiences around engaging with the military as an institution and how that impacts on their health and well-being. I also do some work with children who are growing up or have grown up in military families to understand their experiences as well as the in-service piece, that post-service piece. So just completed some work that is starting to look at what happens after families leave service, which again is something that we don't know very much about, to try and capture some of those experiences as people leave the military and go back into civil society.
Thank you for that overview. It's a subtle nuance, but I like how you said when families leave service. Not just when the active serving person leaves service, but when family leaves service. And that's something that we've highlighted throughout this series, and I think we'll chat about a bit more today. The other thing I find interesting is we've had people on from Canada, from the UK and Australia, and the common theme is we noticed we were behind in military research, and everyone feels behind. And you've highlighted behind the US because that seems to be kind of the case.
So for me personally, I grew up in a military family. So I was naturally drawn to this work, but I was a high school teacher for many, many years and now run a child trauma research center at the University of Regina. And so when this concept looking at family research came up, I mean, it's near and dear to my heart for sure, but our work situates itself more in public safety personnel family research, not as much military, but definitely building on and drawing from the excellent work that has been done in military family research up to this point. And it's interesting because public safety personnel family research, it's, in my opinion, budding. It's beginning. There's amazing people doing incredible work, but it's at this moment of And so I was really fortunate to be able to come alongside Dr. Heidi Krem and Dr. Heather Hadjisteropoulos to look at what about the families in public safety? What about the families that also, like you said, Nicholas, include the serving person. So not from an approach of and the family. So not the public safety personnel and the family, but public safety personnel families where the serving person is deeply embedded in their family unit. So the lay of the land has really, where our work has situated itself, is really looking at the lifestyle dimensions that make public safety personnel family experiences different than what would be typical. And also, where are the overlaps and differences with military family experiences? So that's where we situate ourselves.
That's very interesting. I might actually start with the question there. What are the similarities and the differences that we see in public safety personnel? Because you're right. What I've been seeing in the research is there was a lot of this idea of that we'll include the public safety personnel in the military research because of similar experiences. But now we're actually getting to the point where there's been such a growth in the public safety personnel research that it's looking at how are these occupations different and how do they experience similarities, but they need more research in their own right. What are we seeing as differences, lifestyle dimensions between public safety personnel and military families?
Again, I'll say, having grown up in a military family, the biggest difference that I have awakened to by being part of this research is my dad trained in a relatively safe place, in a relatively safe community for many, many years, and then was deployed to an unsafe place, fulfilled his duties there, and then returned to a relatively safe, stable place with access to food and resources and community and other families and things like that. Where when I think about public safety personnel, they often serve right in the communities that they live and are exposed to potentially traumatic events on the daily and have to leave their home for a shift and come back to that home in the community where they're experiencing a lot of exposure to a lot of difficult things. And that is very, very different. And again, I'm saying this in very general terms, but then what I experienced in my military family, where we didn't think about how our particular communities in which we were embedded, the bases we were living on, were unsafe. It never felt like that. And so that is a massive difference, I think, in terms of experientially, both for the serving personnel as well as for the family members. There's almost this more direct, immediate contact with what the job is and what it means and being on the job on the daily for public safety personnel in a way that's different than military. Some sectors experience similar things like mobility, right? If you think about RCMP, there's postings, some don't. Some are more localized and stay in the same places. And there are similar logistical requirements in terms of adhering to a chain of command and some organizational experiences or expectations, some similar risks. And definitely there's a strong identity piece, although the different sectors of military may have different identities. I mean, if you think even within the military, one of the first questions people ask, are you Air Force, are you Navy, are you Army, right? There are identities embedded. But identity is a common factor in how that influences the living. So for me, the biggest difference I've seen is that the communities in which you are embedded really are the source in a lot of situations for public safety personnel, what they see in their exposure to potentially traumatic events.
I think that's some really interesting points there. I think the thing that I was kind of picking up on what we talk about a lot around military families is this kind of layering of experiences. So some of the experiences military families have are similar to other occupations, right? But they are layered and concentrated in different ways within this particular occupational group. And some of those are beneficial. Having a military community wrap around you is wonderful from all accounts. Yes, there's stress and strains within that, but there's something very rewarding and welcoming and something about belonging within that community as well. To your point earlier, Nick, about the similarities and differences that we see across these organizations, trying to unpick that and what that looks like, is in some ways trying to unpick these different layers and understand how they operate and work in different ways. And that piece around community that you were talking about there, Nathalie, and the fact that military tends to, at least still here in the UK, we still have that kind of base system, although we're moving away from that a little bit. That loss of community is going to be really important. but having so much of that in the public safety personnel community, at least not in the same way as the military, I think is something that is really an important difference to try and understand, because some of that logistical support or emotional support or just understanding, I don't have to explain to you what it's like to be married to someone in the police or a paramedic or whatever. That understanding, shared common understanding is really important. And the other piece, which sits a little alongside some of the military work as people shift off those bases and move into more of a civilian environment, to try to understand how the public interact with that. And I imagine that for certain public safety personnel, that's really important, particularly police, with some of the political movements that we've seen, how they feel within that community as well. So it's not always the occupational stresses. It's these kind of community-based stresses and how people might feel being supported or not within the military, within public safety personnel, and then similarly with the military, as we maybe see that movement off base as well. And I wonder if there's something in that evolution of community that is going to be interesting to try and understand as well.
Rachel, you just made me think of my own personal experience where I went to school on military bases where our teachers were often partners serving people and carried an embodied understanding of the lifestyle and what it meant. And then later in my life, I returned to a neighboring community at that base where the schools had been closed. And now the kids were going to school out in the civilian community and felt very much lost, or that their experience wasn't understood in the same way. And I've always thought what an interesting thing that would have been to study in the happening. But I was 15 and not thinking in those ways then. But now, I just understanding that complexity, the varied expectations and belonging or not belonging to community, or having your community diffused within a greater civilian community, changes things. What you were saying just reminded me of that experience.
An interesting thing from my perspective, similar to you, Dr. Reid, as you just brought up. So I went to a military school on a military base as well, but as a civilian. It just happened that the school that I went to down the road, it ended at grade 6. And then we didn't start high school till grade 9. So the only school around for grades 7 and 8 was Lundy's Lane in Kingston, Ontario, which was a military school. So as a civilian student, I was not aware of any of these nuances of military families. The new kid that came in was still the new kid that came in partway through the semester. So I'm interested in that idea. And I've actually had conversations about this, about teachers and their understanding the cultural competency of military families. And was that education there? And it's interesting how you mentioned that they were usually spouses of military members. I'm not sure if that was the case for me or not. I was so unaware of it that I don't know if that was the case. I think there could be a lot of work to be done in that area, because now we are moving off bases in Canada. We talk about this with Dr. Norris as well, the shift off bases and the communities, and now military children in civilian schools. One thing I wanted to talk about, both of you in your work mentioned the idea of identities. When we say identities in the research, what kind of identities do we form within the militaries, and how are identities formed?
We could spend a lot of time talking about that one particular piece. What I'm particularly interested in is that, so partners haven't signed up to join the military, but how is it that their experiences, their perceptions, the roles that they are ascribed or given within the community or take on within the community shift and change their perception of themselves and their identity of themselves. And some of that can be really positive experiences as well. So we have a lot of positive experience around things like parenthood. So being able to be quite safe community, feeling a lot of belonging and a lot of wraparound care that's available there for you. And other people know your experience and know if your partner is deployed, what it is that you need, and they kind of step up and support that. And then you have these other almost reluctance or resistance against some of these ascribed identities, particularly around rank. So you are now Captain so-and-so's wife, or you are the commanding officer, and the roles and responsibilities that come with that. Some of those identity pieces are around the doing that is awarded or required within that community. Some of it is about what people take on themselves. I'm very happy to be called Captain so-and-so's wife. Maybe that's very proud about that. Sometimes there's some nuances and tensions and confusion between all of these experiences that people are having. That role of parenthood as well, whether people feel, I say people, it's largely female partners, whether they feel comfortable being a sole parent, whether that was an identity that they thought that they would step into, or actually that sort of idealized family life is two parents at home. They come home at 5 o'clock in the evening, we're both out working, those sorts of things. So what I guess I'm trying to get to in the work that I do around identity is trying to understand how some of those roles ascribed, taken on, resisted within people's experiences within the military community, particularly partners, but also children, how they take those on and learn through being part of a military family, and what impact that might have on how people see themselves, what that might do to their health and well-being. So self-confidence, self-esteem, whether we start getting into more severe sort of mental health outcomes, depression, anxiety, substance misuse, all things like pride, resilience as well. We see a lot of that within the community as well of, yes, I'm in this situation, but I just have to get on with it. I'm trying to embrace that. And in itself, becoming part of the identity of partners post-service, in particular, the recent work that we've just done in the UK looking at veteran families, of their experiences in service being something that is something to be really proud of. You could take with you and take into the future. I am a part of a veteran. I have all these skills because of that. So it's quite tangled between understanding where it is roles, responsibilities, identities, and how people take it on.
And I'd like to echo definitely the layered complexity of trying to tease out identity, individual, community, organization, external, internal, conferred, adopted, embodied. It is a very, very complex factor to consider, and yet so important, because when we start thinking with family, we think about all of those aspects in relation to a particular occupation and how that occupation is defining or being defined for them. And so it is a very difficult answer. But when I think about it, I tease out certain elements, like the sector identities are quite strong. And like Rachael has said so beautifully, sometimes it's very positive, right? Sometimes those sector identities are incredibly positive. Sometimes they are less so. In my work, when I think about children and youth, I have a friend who they are a RCMP family, and their children, when asked, what does your parent do? They lie. They don't say it, because there then becomes an identity expectation conferred upon them about who their friends are, how they behave. We don't want to go to your house, or maybe you're going to rat us out to your parents when we do something that's probably pretty typical for a 14-year-old, but those kinds of pieces, right? So there are really embedded and important variables to consider when we think about sector-specific identities. But then there's also the public perception piece. And so there is a very large influence on how particular public safety and military sectors are represented in social media, in movies, on TV shows, and the stories that get threaded through about corruption, or, and I don't like the word heroes, but that sort of heroic, courageous, definitely do shape the public's perception of the identity of particular sectors. And that has an influence. It can be a very difficult thing to navigate, or a very empowering thing to navigate. My brother-in-law is a firefighter, and he said, even when things don't go as we hope, people still thank us. And he said, that's not true of other public safety sectors. And I thought, oh, that's a really interesting point to think about when we're thinking about all these identity pieces. Of course, there's the individual piece and then the familial piece in our work. So it's very interesting. Since we've started doing this PSPNET Families, which I'm sure we'll talk about, we've talked to a lot of family members, and some are very happy to say, I'm a fire family. We're a fire family. And others are like that. Will not identify with the job first. We are humans. Don't call me a fire family. And it's split depending on the person you speak to and the experiences that they've lived. So again, that complexity, we can't nail things into nice little neat boxes because it just really doesn't exist, particularly in these sectors.
You're talking about those external identities that sometimes we forget in this space as well. We focus so much on the occupational identities, or those identities that come from the occupation or surround that occupation. And sometimes we forget that, particularly for, it's probably more so for the military, but particularly for partners and children, they also have these external identities outside. So they go to school, they're interacting with friends, extended family as well. And that kind of external piece that is really important to think about, and what that can afford people in stepping out sometimes from these ascribed identities. Or maybe if I've got some breathing space to not be Captain so-and-so's wife, maybe it's fine that I will be that within the military community because I have this other identity outside. So it's also trying to unpick what it is that different identities, different hats that people are wearing, and changing those throughout the day or throughout the week, and those relationships that people have that can be beneficial as well as sometimes challenging, to try and marry those up and work through them and to try and keep them, particularly around employment. But the importance that then gives people at creating some of these external identities, which are just as important and really beneficial for their health and well-being.
Very, very interesting points brought up there. The one thing I'm interested too is we've mentioned a couple times you might be captain so-and-so spouse. And that's interesting because it's that snapshot in time. Maybe there'll always be that person's spouse, maybe not. But the idea is that snapshot in time. We know that the serving member goes through these changing identities and this transition of they were captain or they are captain. And there could be difficulties with transition. But the family must go through the same kind of changes in identity as a military family member. What do we know in the research? We talk about how identities form as a snapshot in time, but what about how they longitudinally, in a sense, change over time as well, and the impact of that on families?
I would say, and Nathalie may or may not agree, that we don't know very much about the kind of long-term change. And we're trying to understand that, particularly in the qualitative work, where that's a little bit easier. If I win the lottery or I win that giant funding grant, would be something I would love to explore from the point that someone is in a relationship with someone who is about to join up, has joined up. They enter that relationship, they go into service, whether that's a public safety personnel, whether that's as the military, and then you follow them through. And you have these regular touch points, which then capture these changes in identity. That's the dream, is to be able to do that. I think I've been able to capture in some of the work that I've done around changes in identity around becoming a parent, and how it becomes much more restrictive, particularly for women within the community, as a certain way of being a good military spouse, in quotes, thinking of Cynthia Enlow and all of her work, which becomes a little bit more restrictive for women. They don't have some of those external sources that they're relying on for identity, so and professional career in particular, although not necessarily. So we know a little bit about that. I know a little bit about, or starting to be more work post-service and that kind of transition piece, and how families transition as well, their experiences. Some being very willing to leave before the serving member actually gets around to leaving the military. And some who they have very similar experiences to those challenging experiences that we hear personnel having, really struggling, at being kind of a culture shock. They feel abandoned by the military or not supported in the way that perhaps they were used to in service or kind of expected to. And obviously, there's been a lot poured into transition support for veterans and families. They're slowly creeping in around the side to also think about, well, it's not just the personnel who leaves, it's the whole family who leaves. So how is it that we're then going to try and support them? But it's certainly an area that those really long-term qualitative studies would really add a lot of value to trying to understand the nitty-gritty of all this identity work, which is really important in so many parts of the health and well-being. I certainly would say we don't know very much about that at the moment.
I would definitely echo what Rachael is saying about not knowing a lot. It is definitely a gap that we have identified in even the work we did for that short amount of time in terms of looking at end of career or later career even, and then transitioning and that connection to identities and to a dramatic shift in identity from who are you and what do you do and how that identity becomes embedded in who you are to then not being able to use those words anymore and the impact that might have. But something that we did start to attend to was those transition pieces across a career and lifespan, such as becoming a parent or shifting into elder care at a certain point, are very much influenced and affected by the logistics, public safety or military requirements of the occupation. So, for example, if I need to take my aging mother to a doctor's appointment, it's not happening at 10 p.m. when I'm off shift, right? And so then those kinds of responsibilities typically fall to the non-serving member and get loaded on top of their own occupations and their own work and their own whatever, get loaded on top of that because the rest of the world functions pretty much in a 9-to-5 type situation. And so whether that is elder care or having to go to parent-teacher conferences or a sporting event, often those kinds of expectations then fall on the non-serving member or the non-serving family member. And that we've heard over and over again that can lead to role overload and a lot of expectation fatigue shall we say. Yes, also opportunity. There are many people who have told us, they love being able to be part of those pieces, but there is this element that we have to think about in terms of families, of the logistics of the occupation really do impact some of the ability to do things.
Just to add on to that is also there's a rather implicit gender aspect in that as well. So the person who's then taking on caring for that person's aging mother is more likely than not a female partner, a female spouse. And so this is the ways in which we're talking about this layering of experiences, layering of expectations on people, that you see this enforcement or reinforcement of some of these gender roles within military families, and aspects of that, I imagine, also within public safety personnel families as well.
And Dr. Reid, one piece you mentioned in one of your pieces of work was this idea of the spillover into other aspects of life. And I think that's one key piece, is that we identify within the military in different ways, but also we talk about the external. So you're still a parent, you're still a spouse, and it really sounds like that experience in public safety personnel or in military can spill over quite heavily in decision-making opportunities, even things like we talked about public safety personnel in a safe but a more kind of volatile community, maybe unsafe. I can only imagine the spillover in parenting your child, knowing about what's happening in that community, maybe more heightened awareness, that identity, that role shifts over into all other identities as well.
Absolutely. And that hypervigilance, if you have seen, and particularly it's not my research, but there's research out there that says, if a public safety personnel has had an exposure while on shift to something that reminds them of their own family. So, something involving children or something involving a parent, whatever, that hypervigilance, it's almost impossible for it not to translate in some way. We're human. It's not like we can go turn myself on in this context and then turn it off. And so thinking a lot about spillover and transition times and healthy ways of navigating was a big part of our PSPNET families. Even at the very basic level, so many families told us they just feel out of sync with the real world. And that really impacted me. I had to really unpack what they were telling me with those very, very clear but very few words. But when we think about, again, the schedules of a typical 9-to-5 society, and then we try to pair that with shift work. Families were telling us that one of the spillover aspects is that they couldn't plan anything, because it's not just a planned shift, but it is an unscheduled call-in or unscheduled overtime. And they were tired of feeling like they were letting either their extended family members down by having to leave or having to change plans, or that they were tired of having to try to explain to friends, no, I can't make a plan for in 3 weeks because I'm going to then have to probably change it. And that's a very sort of objective logistical thing that then has kind of a lot of emotional weight within the family context. So when we think about spillover, it happens in the ways that we can definitely predict or understand, but then also in these other ways that, unless we start doing the research and talking to public safety or military families, you don't really know. It's not as obvious. I have a whole bunch of other ones, but those are the two that I think best exemplify, right? That yes, exposure to traumatic events. There's just no way for us to dehumanize ourselves or compartmentalize to the point where everything's fine here. And the logistic occupational requirements that then also affect what happens to the family outside of work.
Very well said. Perfect lead-in, PSPNET families. And for the listeners who might not know about PSPNET, first of all, public safety personnel, we've said most of the time, but the acronym for that will be PSP. So for PSPNET families, what is that? And you've also highlighted risk and logistics, relocation we've talked about within this episode. How is all that included in the development of PSPNET families?
Absolutely. So I'm going to just take one quick little step sideways so this makes a lot of sense. PSPNET, so Public Safety Personnel Net. It's an online platform that offers internet-delivered cognitive behavioral therapy for public safety personnel. And it was developed and up and running. And then there was a call from the Public Health Agency of Canada. And the idea was, okay, what about the families? And what can we do? And so myself, alongside, again, Dr. Heidi Cram and Dr. Heather Hedges-Gerbopoulos, who was the creator of PSPNET, we thought, let's create something supportive of and responsive to public safety personnel families. And when we began, it felt a lot like that plate of spaghetti that we were talking about in terms of identities. How do we do this in a way? I mean, there are multiple sectors, and there is a career life trajectory and a family life trajectory, and how do we conceptualize this in a way that acknowledges the unique characteristics of the different sectors, but also cannot be so specific that people can see themselves across the entire offering and be valuable and useful way to spend their time. So we started with thinking about these lifestyle dimensions and the pieces of public safety family life that people had told us about were in the research. We drew from military family research because there really wasn't a whole lot for us to go off of. And so we took all these pieces, and you would be astounded to see the web that was created because they're all interrelated, but they're all distinct and discrete. And it was quite a mess. But what we were able to see once we did that mapping was logistics, risks, and identities were definitely factors that everything else kind of fit under, that we were able to see shaped public safety family life as different. And for some sectors, mobility, which is a good, like we said, military overlap. So from there, we thought, okay, if we have these pieces that we've said, yes, this would be important, then we thought about audience. And my mom married my dad without really even knowing Canada had an Air Force, right? So I imagined if my mom was coming to this kind of resource, what would she need? All the way through to if someone had been in public safety, whether as a serving member of family, for 25 years, what might they be coming for? And so trying to understand the various audiences and the various entry points. It was a massive undertaking, I'm not going to lie. But then we ended up being able to filter down to topics, which we then created information pages. So if I don't know about something, I can come here. And if you go to PSPNETFamilies.ca, you can see that there are categories of information that you can look. And so we thought, okay, that's a good starting point, particularly for people who are like, this is new. I don't know what this is about. Let me go there. Or I'm struggling with this. Let me see what is being said. But then we thought there are also people who have been in the midst. They understand, and they really just need something to do or to try. And so then we developed a second subsection of strategies and skill building exercises. So yes, they're connected to the information, but you can also just go right to a strategy. And they are different things. They're interactive. You can download, watch videos, that kind of stuff to really have something concrete and practical you can try in your familial context today. And I'd really like to say too, we really bumped with a very typical definition of family. And so we very much come at this work with a very open understanding that family really includes whether they are your biological or chosen or relational relationships that a person would define as a chosen or adopted or biological family member. That includes not just parents and children, but it also includes adults, children, adult siblings, so friends, family friends, those kinds of things. That's where we started, was we're not trying to portray or recreate some kind of normative understanding of what family is. That's not our business here. So we have the information pages, we have the strategies and skill building pages, and we were like, but what if someone needs something more? Because those are pretty upstream supports. What if someone is like, I need to work on me in this context? And so that's where the spouse and significant other well-being course was included on our well-being hub. And so that's an internet-delivered cognitive behavioral therapy course, which is an adaptation of the one that's offered on PSPNET for service people, but for family members. And what we love about that is that it's this beautiful natural bridge that a spouse could be working on. We call it the SSO, the spouse or significant other well-being course, while the serving person could be working on the well-being course. And while the examples are different and the case studies are a little bit different based on how you're coming to it, really the trajectory is the same, or you could do it independently. And so what this all turned out to was PSPNET Families, a well-being hub where we offer these upstream well-being supports for public safety personnel on a variety of topics. And it has this sort of spiraling design where you can move up through or down through. You can connect in different ways based on what you need. And that's PSPNET Families.
That is a great overview. Thank you very much. And just to highlight again, it's pspnetfamilies.ca, correct?
Absolutely.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Last question I have for the both of you again, and I tend to ask this one at the end of the episodes. We've talked about how family research has evolved, and I'm assuming both of you aren't stopping your family research today because you've hit all the goals you ever want to hit. So where does family research go from here? Where do you see gaps in the field where you hope that you're moving on to?
So from our work on PSPNET Families, one of the main things that we know right now we want to do so that the Wellbeing Hub doesn't stagnate is spend more time looking at end of career and transition and that kind of piece. 100%. That's a commitment we've already made. But interestingly, whenever we present about the Wellbeing Hub, we are immediately asked at least twice, what about PSPNET kids or PSPNET youth? And so I'm always like, yes, because that is my passion and my desired movement. And so again, hoping for some wonderful funding, and then that will definitely be the place that we move. The last gap, I think, and it's not really a gap because it comes from emergent contexts. So here in Canada last summer, we had just the worst summer of wildfires we've ever had. And what we saw was a large portion of volunteer firefighters actually being deployed for months to communities that weren't there. And I'm not sure that there's been a whole lot of work looking at the impact on those firefighters, but also on their families because they had to leave their paid work to go volunteer firefight. And so I really always want to stay attentive to these emergent realities that are surfacing so that what we do is actually really responsive. Those are where I have my map for the future. Those are the 3 directions.
It's really so tricky, isn't it? There's so many different areas that it would be wonderful to go into. I think the area that I'm quite interested in trying to understand more about is so-called non-traditional families. Families that don't quite fit this very heteronormative idea that we have as families. Married couple, one's a man, one's a woman. It's usually him that's in the service or in the job, and they have 2.5 children. So I was trying to understand, if you don't quite fit into that identity, what are your experiences like of being a military family? Are there any differences? It might be that actually, no, it's a leveler as an occupation and everyone is judged based on skill and all of these sorts of things. There might be other experiences as well. So LGBT plus, how are their experiences? Try and open up more of this diversity. Minority groups, whether those are ethnic minority groups, gender identity groups, women in service, men as partners, anyone who doesn't fit that. I think that would be my next step. And I'll stop there because I could go on with a massive long shopping list of all the wonderful things I would love to do.
That's great,
if
Dr.
we won
Gribble.
the lottery and got the grant.
Yes, that's right.
Yes.
Yeah. Dr. Gribble, what I will add for listeners too, that's actually next week's episode. We'll be talking about who are family members from the 2SL LGBTQIA plus community. We'll be talking a little bit about where that research is at. So thank you for bringing that up. Very, very good ideas. And I think it's obvious that the future of family research is in good hands with everyone that we've had on as guests. So to end there, I want to thank you both for taking the time for joining the Beyond the Battlefield podcast today. The insights today were great. I'm sad we have to end it at this point because there's still a lot to talk about, but I really enjoyed the conversation. So thank you both for the time you've taken today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you again to Dr. Gribble and Dr. Reid. Please continue the conversation with us by following the SIMVR and the JMVFH on Facebook and LinkedIn. Now that you've listened to the Beyond the Battlefield podcast, episode 5, we invite you to complete a short survey by clicking on the survey link in the podcast description section below. Your input helps us create content that's valuable to you. On next week's episode, we sit down with Dr. Vince Connolly and Ash Ibbotson to discuss underrepresented groups in military research. You won't want to miss it. Thank you for taking the time to listen today. Please subscribe to the podcast and leave us a review. Until next time, take care and stay well. Goodbye for now.